Welcome to this week's session of our Lent course. So far, we've looked at the church building and our worship and prayer life. We've looked at the spiritual temperature of the church today. And last week, we looked at uniting the church. There are treasures within our buildings, both within the physical building itself, but also in terms of what happens inside. But yes, there are times when a church might need to reignite itself. Perhaps the fire has gone out. And whilst we might see treasure in the church, there is also baggage. And for some, it is that baggage that has caused churches and denominations to split over the centuries, leading to disunity rather than unity. But we must never lose sight of what holds us together. For there is more that unites us than what separates us. We can find harmony in our diversity. And diversity is something that we should celebrate. One of the books that I read as I explored ordination in the Anglican Church was Backpacking Through the Anglican Communion, a search for unity. In it, the writer Jess Zink wrote about his experiences visiting Anglican churches across the globe. One chapter, Holding Together Diversity, was centred on the Diocese of Ely, where Jess identified the breadths of tradition comparing, for example, two churches in Cambridge just a few hundred yards apart. The University Church of Great St Mary's, with its high Anglican expression of churchmanship, and Holy Trinity as a thriving Anglican evangelical church. That is what is great about the Anglican communion, in that for the most part, we can be united in our diversity. But what's next for us in this penultimate week? We are next. You and I. It's time to move on from looking at the treasures in the church, the building and what happens inside, to looking at the treasure that is you and the treasure that is me. The treasures that we find inside ourselves. The gifts that God has given each and every one of us. But before we start looking at what we might call spiritual gifts, I want us to look at the gift of God's love. I want to encourage you to talk in your groups about a precious personal story of how God has shown love for you. The treasures that we have found are what we might call spiritual gifts. And there are many lists of gifts within the Bible. One list that I came across suggests 20 different gifts. Which ones have you been given? As Christians, there are some questions that we need to know the answer to. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." And I would suggest that we should also be prepared to give the answer to the question, what gifts has God given us? For some, this might be a difficult question. Throughout my time of following God's call and seeking ordination, I've been asked many questions around my gifts and my strengths. And for some strange reason, I used to find it difficult to give an answer. Perhaps that was the humility shining through. But I came to realise that sometimes I needed to have the answer. And I needed to be able to confidently respond to those questions. A little later on, I want to encourage us to explore what our spiritual gifts might be, those treasures that we hold within us. But before we move on to that, let us first take a look at 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 to 31. One body with many members. This is a passage that we touched on briefly last week, so I thought it would be good to use this passage today. I mentioned earlier that we should always be prepared to give an answer to the various questions that we may be asked. I said that in the past I had found it difficult to recognise what my gifts were. in the same way that I'd found it difficult to recognise my strengths. There may be any number of reasons why we would feel uncomfortable about this. Humility, false pride. Perhaps we see some gifts as more important than others, so we feel that we might be second-class citizens. Maybe jealousy takes root. Perhaps we feel we might be given a gift that we don't want, or we wouldn't be confident in using. But if you reached into the treasure chest and pulled out a gift from God for you, what would it contain? Imagine you're looking back. So this is not just a gift for the future. It's a gift that you've already received. You've been using it in the past, you're using it today, and you'll continue to use it in the future. If we had time today, we could take part in a spiritual gifts exercise. This would help us to identify our gifts by completing a questionnaire. This is something I ended up having to do in order to identify my strengths whilst I was seeking ordination. In hindsight, the results were pretty much what I might have said about myself, if only I could have persuaded myself to take part in what I saw at the time as self-promotion. But I guess what it showed was that I did have strengths and that I shouldn't be fearful about sharing them. Indeed, I had to go on and write a whole essay around them. So whilst we don't have time for a full spiritual gifts exercise today, I would like us to go back into our groups to explore our gifts a little further. I want to encourage us to share with each other what we feel our gifts might be. Now I know that you might not have the answer today, but this does give us the opportunity to at least explore this subject amongst friends. So if we are struggling to answer this question, maybe ask those in your group what they think your gifts might be. I've just realised that I sat here to shoot the first video this morning. What I hadn't realised was this painting that's behind me. God so loved the world. I think it's fascinating how God works sometimes and bring these things together, because that first video was the video that I asked you to look at God's gift for you. And that is, of course, his son Jesus. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. But as we move to the closing session for this afternoon, I know it can be uncomfortable asking ourselves questions such as that. What are our gifts? It is meant to be a positive exercise where we can celebrate all the gifts that God has given us. But I know negatives can come out of it. It's like when we are asked to look at our strengths, because the question is usually, what are our strengths and weaknesses? There's always a flip side to the question, even if it's not mentioned as such. Throughout this course, we've been looking at the treasures within, but we have mentioned in previous weeks about the baggage that might be affecting us as a church, the baggage that might be holding us back, the baggage that might be stifling the fire. And what about us as individuals? We have the treasure within, our joys, our success, our gifts. But what about the baggage? Our sorrows, times that we might see as failures. We all carry these wounds, and they might be affecting us today. So whilst we might want to celebrate the treasures within, and it's right to do so, I know there may be baggage as well. Now, we're not going to discuss these openly today, but after celebrating the treasures, the gifts that you have received, if anything comes to mind that might be considered as baggage, and if you want to talk them through in confidence, please do get in touch or talk to someone that you can trust and confide in. I love the concept behind Ignatian spirituality. One of its focuses is to look back at the day gone by and ask, where was God in my day? It encourages us to look at what we found consolation in, but it also asks us to look at what we found desolation in. And I want to try some of this now, to spend a few moments in silent contemplation, but to look back and search for the treasure within us, the gifts that God has given us, and to thank Him for those gifts, but also to spend time searching for the baggage that might be weighing us down and stopping the treasure from being realised in our lives. So as we listen to the music, let us meet with God to thank Him for the treasures and to ask Him to release us from the baggage.